Well, good evening. Welcome to our evening Bible class. We're going to be doing a survey. We've been doing surveys of the books. So if you want to go ahead and open up your Bibles we got quite a little ring. You want to open up to the book of Esther? We're going to be doing a survey. We've been going through, we did Joshua, we did Judges, we did Ruth, and we're going to do Esther tonight. And then next week, we'll start into 1 Samuel and look at Samuel. And again, we're not trying to do in-depth study on it. So we just and there's 10 chapters with this book. So as we're going through it, and there's something specific I want to talk about, bring it up. Because I'm kind of hitting it at a very large lens as we go through this. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer and then we'll get started. Our most gracious Father, thank you so much for this time that we have to be able to come here and to worship you and to study your word, especially this book of Esther, Father. It's a beautiful story that we can learn so much. We hope that we'll be able to have our hearts prepared to where we can listen and learn some lessons that we can apply into our lives. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. So if you're joining us online at this time on YouTube, you can go ahead and if you want to get involved, get engaged in the class, you can drop in comments. I can sit and see them and interact with you. Okay, so as we start this book of Esther, I kind of chose because Ruth and Esther, even though they're not real close in timeline, Ruth is right during the end of the time of the period of Judges, which was a very dark period, but it was a beautiful story. And then Esther, I think, is important because it's going to be something that you're going to, hopefully it's not just a review to you. That's why I'm trying to hit the class a little higher because there's a lot of fascinating things about it. And a lot of times some people have looked at it and said, well, what's important? What's important about this book? And there's a lot of things that we'll see that's so amazing, even the style in which it's written, that brings out something fascinating. One of the things is that regardless of where God's people are, he takes care of them. And that's a strong message for us today, isn't it? That sometimes we feel that way. And we see his providential working. And when we talk about providential, we mean God is making things happen, but it's not in a miraculous form. And he doesn't tell you when he's doing it. He doesn't ever reveal himself. And that's something in this book, his name is not mentioned anywhere. God is not brought up in the whole book of Esther. It's like the only book that in the Bible where he's never mentioned. So it's kind of, a lot of people have said, so why? When we look at it historically too, it's kind of like, what's the significance of this book? Because they're not in Jerusalem. They're not back recovering. And after the captivity. So why is that? And I think it's because this book is to show us, and I think more so for us today, that God is doing something, that God is working. It's so hard sometimes. A lot of times we look at some decision we're making and we wonder, well, is that the door God's opening for me? We wonder, is this what is being taken care of? I've said it recently again, and it sounds like a broken record, but, a lot of my faith has been built on my rearview mirror. I can look in it and see everything God has done for me after it's done and go, wow, how did all that happen? How did all these pieces come together and work through these problems? But I didn't see them when I'm staring in the future, what I'm looking at right now. And so that's providence. Providence is where God has been doing things, but he's not going to sit and just tell you everything that's going on. So that's a part of this great message. The other thing is how pride destroys. And we're going to see a part of that. Another one we see why it's important is because of courage. You're looking at people that are Jewish, that are in basically under a foreign land, controlled by pagan king, and there's a lot of different cultural things that are going on that make it very difficult. And we see that Esther's going to be really challenged with that. How do you stand up, and not lose your life to this pagan king? And this whole story is kind of, it's it, this is really, if you've ever seen, been a few movies that's been done that articulate this great plot, because it's a reversal. In other words, it starts out one direction, and then everything that happens in up to chapter 6 is then after chapter 6 is reversed. It just goes a whole nother direction from what you see. So that's why I say reversal drives it. So what I mean, and a lot of times when it comes to our lives, we'll see a lot of things in our lives that are happening, negative, 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 negative. All these things that are happening that just seem to be going one direction. And yet then all of a sudden, something will happen and it'll turn. And everything after that is like the opposite of all those other things that happen to you. And that's actually a style. We'll get into it. So let's talk a little bit about the history, our historical timeline, where it falls. I always find that is something that if you can be aware of it, I think it's important. It helps to give you an idea of what's going on in the world around the Bible. When we read, a lot of times we don't know what's happening. What's Rome? Is it Greece? Alexander the Great? Some of these other names historically that are going on around you that happened. So me by now that I like to tie that in. So we look at the timeline, 1000 BC, and that's where we're going to pick up the book before this, because First Samuel is going to continue, but going to start to show where the first king comes, but they're not united. So, around 1100 BC, but then the United Kingdom's around 1000. The kingdom divides in about 100 years, 900 BC, and then we see judgment, and the Assyrians come along and take the northern tribes out and disperse them, and they pretty much are gone. Deports that northern kingdom. Well, we know that in 600, the Babylonians start coming in, and the Babylonians, in a wave, successively destroy and end up taking Jerusalem and burning it to the ground. Well, a little bit different from the Assyrians. The Assyrians were more into total degradation of your culture. I mean, you just basically, they divided their captives up to the point where their culture was totally lost. Babylonians were a little different. The Babylonians, they kept a lot of larger cultures together. So the Jews that they brought off of Judah and brought into Babylon were in the regions around there, but there were collective areas that you can find in different cities where a large group of the deportees, the Jews that had come out, were collected and living, and they settled. Now imagine for 70 years, I remember hearing Gary just say a while ago as he's talking to Hamilton, I've been here 70 years. And it just made me think of that just now, that 70 years, and like he said, even his mom was born here, right? So you get settled. So so what you'd think that whenever they were set free, that they could go back, that there would be all of them just wanting to get back over there to Judah. That's God's promised land. That's not what happened. About nearly just barely 500 go back with Ezra and Nehemiah. Most of them stay dispersed. Now, that's good and bad, because good in the sense that what you find is this system of synagogues that end up being established throughout the area that the Jews had started living comfortable and raising their families. And those synagogues are going to be what? They're going to be the launching point for, like Paul, when the gospel goes. Where does he go? When he starts traveling out there, he goes to all those synagogues. Why? Because they know the law and the prophets and the poets. They understand God's covenant. So it's interesting that we're at a point where in this historical time where God's people have been removed, and it seems like it's such a bad thing. But remember, it's interesting that God, even though he's punishing a lot of times, some of the most beautiful things God's able to come and deliver out of that. And so the exile and the Jews settling there in captivity is going to see where we're coming into this story of Esther. But then in 450, we see the Medo-Persians. Now, you'll hear Medo-Persian in the beginning of the conquest of Babylon. And they were the Medes and the Persians. They kind of joined together. The Persians, well, I think most people understand, that's pretty much Iran. And then the Medes were kind of up a little bit, I guess you'd say, west of them. And there was a union that had joined between them, long story short. And so they brought the Medo-Persian, they grouped together, and then they came in and took out Babylon. But you'll find real quick that you don't hear about the Mede side of it because Cyrus takes over. He takes over. And so the Medes, that name just falls off. So at the beginning, you'll hear that. So if you hear Medo, I used to get confused. Well, why do you say Medo-Persian, and then you hear Persian all the time? And that's why, because once they conquer Babylon, then Cyrus pretty much dominates, and it's Persian from there on. But he keeps the captives at first. It's about a year before Cyrus finally makes his decree, which we've been looking at Isaiah on Sunday, right, in the evenings. As a matter of fact, we've been talking about Babylon and talking about how in Isaiah 47 that Cyrus was prophesied by name. The only king that's ever been prophesied 150 years before he was born was Cyrus. And so at this time, we're seeing where Cyrus, after 1 year, allowed all the peoples to go back, not just the Jews, everyone. If you wanted to return, and he actually gave all the articles of the temple, money, and helped all those different cultures go out, go home, and reestablish their temples or whatever their religion was. See how different that is? I mean, from any other king before, my king is my God's everyone's God, right? And you're going to follow my God. Cyrus was different. And that's interesting because, again, if you go to Isaiah, that's exactly what Isaiah prophesied about, was how he was going to return them and that Cyrus was going to build the Lord's house. Now, he didn't directly do it, but by him letting them go back. So it's after that exile, and we see that during this Persian period, we don't know exactly when Esther's wrote. Well, we kind of do because we know the king. It's not Cyrus. It's about 3 kings later. So we're still after Cyrus dies, and then, but the setting is in one of the royal cities. Probably in the primary one was Susa. Now that is on the very western portion of Iran today. Beautiful, beautiful area. A lot of times when we think of the Middle East, we just think of dust and desert. Like somebody says the Southwest, and they just think all we have is tumbleweeds out here, right? But this area here is really gorgeous, and there's a lot of archaeological sites that they've dug up that are beautiful. Cyrus's grave is still there, tomb. There's some wonderful things there, but it was considered the royal tomb, the royal city there. The king is Arceus, and now that is his Greek name. His Greek name is Xerxes, and that's the one that when we start to get into the movie like 600, was that right? The Spartans. As soon as I said 600, I went, it's not 600, 300. Artaxerxes, Xerxes, it's going to be, some believe it is this guy that we're going to be reading about that does the first invasion into Greece and such, but then is defeated, and then his son, Artaxerxes, comes along, and then that's where we start to see some of that. So it's that's why I say it's really cool to kind of like think about it and understand more than just a limited view of, well, that's a name in the Bible, that where is it historically on the timeline? Like I already said, many of the Jews are still scattered in the empire, but these people are still under a covenant relationship, and a lot of times, you think, well, they didn't go back, so they weren't spiritual, and that's not true. Like I said, most of the locations where they had settled, they built places that they could come together and read the law, and that they could pray They couldn't offer sacrifices, so it would be a limited form of being able to truly worship. I don't know how they compromised on that, but they were still a covenant people. And that's important because, God hasn't forgot about them. You'd think that God would be upset that they all didn't go back to the promised land. And that's what I think makes this book very unusual. There's a lot of things about what you read. There's a lot of drinking, a lot of banquets. There's some, we're going to talk about, some things that we're going to see that for a Jew to be doing, that's no. You'd say, what are you doing? So there's a lot of things about this. You'd say, well, why would you want that Mordecai and Esther, they're not really faithful. I mean, in some of the things that we scan over it and don't think about the spiritual side of what they just violated, because they still had dietary restrictions. Remember Daniel, when he went into captivity, how strict he was about, no, I can't eat this. Well, we start to see that there's some compromise that the Jewish exiles who stayed started to do. And so that's what makes it a little bit of a rough book, because, we see where the king is going to throw a drunken party for 6 months, and then he gets mad at his wife, and then he does all this stuff. We'll just move on. So let's pick up with chapter 1, since we're talking about that. I mean, right away in the very first verse, we find out who the king was, Ahasuerus, and he reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. And we find out where his capital was, Susa. So and these are historically factual things that you can look up, you can find, that was there. Now, so for 180 days, he showed the riches and the royal glory and splendor and the prompt of his greatness. Pride, right? What's amazing to me is he is so, it reminds me of royalty and bloodline, where you inherit your royalty and you get your position not because of you earning it. Cyrus earned it. Cyrus, he had to fight and build the kingdom, the empire. A lot of the people after that, like we see that in the medieval times with the kings, their children just took over. The firstborn's son would be the king. Not that he was qualified, worthy, or anything. And there's a lot of pride that comes with that somehow you're entitled because I'm a king. And that's kind of what we see with Arceus, that this idea. So he throws this 6-month. I don't even know how you do that. How do you throw a 6-month, 180 days? But at the end of that, we find that he decides, and it says they were drinking, and I think they were intoxicated, and they decide, well, you know what? Let's have the queen come out. I want the queen, Vashti, to come out. Now, there's a lot of different thoughts around why she refuses. She refuses to come out and go out there. She don't want to be like a show pony, go out there and just show it off. Some, I read, think that because of the mockery of this type of environment, that he may have even wanted her to come out and parade herself and just her crown on. So that, anyway, whatever it might be. And then I've also read that the custom was that the queens never did go to those events, which I don't blame them. They wouldn't go to those banquets like that. So I don't know. But the point is, she refuses, and it angers him. And so he makes a decree to remove her for that refusal to come out in his anger and his wrath. And this is something that we have to really say about him, is that he overreacts, doesn't think through, and then he's stuck with his decision. And that creates a problem, because now, he's depressed and he's upset about it. And so his advisors come and they go, well, there's a lot of young women. Why you need to get a queen? Now his male ego was also being affected, I think. The fact that his wife refused to listen to him and obey him, because then he turned around and makes a decree that husbands are all in charge of their houses. What do you have to say that, To me, that's kind of, you got to remind that who's in charge, you have to make it that way. You can tell it's because he feels like what? He's not in charge. He can't even get the queen to come. So he goes through this elaborate process, brings in, let the young, beautiful virgins be sought out for the king in chapter 2. And so the king appoints officers throughout the empire to seek out the most beautiful women around and bring them in. And they set this up to where they go through this elaborate, what would you call it? Makeover? Just makeup, skin care. I mean, they were doing all sorts of processes as you sit and read through it, what they did to them. And this is where we find Mordecai, who is going to encourage his niece, Esther, to then be a part of this. And now we're starting to see the working of Providence without ever being able to really just say, aha, this is God working. The removal of the queen opens the door. Why did Mordecai, the Jew, decide to go ahead and have his niece become into this process? Because what we find is that during this entire process, after this beautification process of 6 months or so, he then basically has a date and sleeps with all of them to determine which one he wants. That's what I mean about, if you're the uncle Mordecai, you know that you're not to marry foreign people, foreign men, And so that alone starts to go, why would you even think about letting your niece, who is Jewish, marry a Persian? That to me is, and there's no answer. We don't know. I mean, that's what I mean about it. Kind of shows you, and why? Why did he decide that? We don't really know. But it's kind of one of those things where we know the end result. But we look at the start of it. Why would you bring her into that whole wicked process of going through this?
He also told her not to feel that she was not to feel her.
Yeah, that her heritage, who she is, and that says something, doesn't it? I mean, because if you look at some of the people that the king has around him, they're not all just Persian. So what is going on where he would say, don't tell him you're a Jew? There has to be that they're not thought of well. That they don't like. There's something about the culture, maybe because of the fact that they still hold to one God and not accept the gods of the Persians, right? But there's definitely, you don't want him to find out that you're Jewish. So she, though, ends up being selected as queen, and then we see toward the end of chapter 2 that Mordecai discovers a plot that was an assassination plot, and he tells Esther, and she then tells the king, and the king, is grateful. Mordecai saved my life. I'm not going to be assassinated, but it's written down. This is key too. It's journaled, what happened, chronicled, but he doesn't get anything in reward. The king just seems to have forgot about it. And then we move to this guy, Haman, in chapter 3. Haman is an Agite. Does anybody know about the Agites? This is interesting. An Agagite was, yes, Amalekites. Remember them? They were the ones that whenever they're coming out of the Exodus, that they attacked the weak and the people in the back of the caravan as the Exodus across out of Egypt. And God said to Moses, when you settle into the land, you annihilate the Amalekites. And then remember when Joshua was taking over, Joshua was told, take care of the Amalekites, wipe them out. Doesn't happen. Not until Saul. Remember Saul? Samuel comes to Saul. We'll get that next week, right? When we start looking at Samuel. And he tells him, go carry this out. 500 years have gone by the way, from the time that they were basically condemned. Finally, we see that as we go through the period of the judges and then finally Samuel. So this is a long drawn out judgment that God has been holding against the Amalekites. And then King Agag. See, now it starts to sound a little bit more like, an Agagite. So that's the relationship. And so then we see that they have had this hatred. So guess who? That's who Haman is. Haman is from the lineage of the Amalekites. So there's a lot of bitterness all the way through this that we see. But he has ended up being promoted. And he advances him up, sets him up. And this is where we see his pride growing. And he wanted everyone to do what? Bow down to him, right? Bow down to him. This one stubborn guy, Mordecai, wouldn't do it. Mordecai refuses to bow. And so that just incenses him. This is where pride we're starting to see how his arrogance. I remember when I became a second lieutenant in the Army, and we were down at Fort Bliss. And one of the things, we were all brand new lieutenants, right? And so what do enlisted need to do? Salute, right? Now, I had been enlisted, so I knew what it was like to have to salute officers, and so you do it out of respect and stuff. But I remember we were going to the PX one day, and we're walking along, and this poor little private forgot to salute. And one of the lieutenants in there just ripped on that poor little private, and I'm just so embarrassed. I'm like, really? Don't you know you're supposed to salute officers when you come, you pass by them? And I was like, that's what this kind of reminded me of, is the arrogance of like, well, I'm an officer, Army officer, and so you must salute me and show me that respect and stuff. And that's where his pride is going to destroy him, because this is what he then turns around and he plots to not just kill Mordecai. How do you go from, one man won't bow down to let's annihilate the entire race? You talk about overreact. And so I wonder if this hatred is the racism that's still carrying on historically from all the way back, between the Amalekites and the Hebrews. It's just continually progressing through. So he talks the king into making a decree. And again, this king, why would you do that? Just annihilate. This is just more and more confusing about this king, and why would he allow an entire race in your empire to just be killed? I think what's sickening is that then Haman he says, I'll pay 10,000 talents of silver. So, what's the king? Oh, wow, kind of sweeten the pot. So he does. He sets up that death decree to target the Jews. And this is when then we see Esther Mordecai hears about it. He had learned what was going on. And so he approaches. Now, this is the other thing is they know Mordecai's a Jew. So there has to be a very discreet relationship between him and Esther, because finds out they're related, then find out that she's a Jew. So there's a lot of this cloak and dagger type of communication between them as this story goes on, and then informs her of this and kind of, urges her to act. You need to take action. You need to do something. Now, one of the problems, though, is what? When it comes to approaching the king. If the king doesn't ask you to come in as a queen, and you try to go in and see him, that could be death, because you weren't requested. And so she is very aware of the dilemma that if she goes in and approaches the king until he sends for her, then she could be executed. So that's the fear. You can say,
on one verse that Haman was saying, their laws are different from all other people's. They don't even keep your laws. So he tried to make it as worse as bad as he could. Like, there's got to be a reason to annihilate. Fine if they're not going to obey your laws anyway.
That's the way it happens, is you got to build it up and make it worse. And this is why this king is really a bad king. What? He just takes his word for it?
Have you not heard about it before? And it's kind of odd that he's hearing about it now. Out of the 127 provinces, you're telling me that nobody has talked about it?
Yeah. But don't we see that in a lot of, even our country, our presidents we've had throughout from the beginning. We've seen presidents who were unaware of their cabinet members doing certain things or come in and you can, tell the president what's going on because they're in a bubble and they don't seek it out to find out. They just trust them and they get themselves in trouble. There's historically, not just recent, but I mean, seriously, go all the way through all of our presidents and you'll find from the beginning where presidents had really bad people around them, and especially in the 1800s. And they were totally appointed by the fact that they were the friend of the president. Nothing to do with qualifications. Today, that's why today we have Senate confirmation hearings, and it's required. This way, it's not Billy Bob, from your hometown become the Secretary of Defense, that has no clue, but he's your friend. Now there has that. And that's what I see as a huge failure with what's going on. And so Esther approaches the king and makes a request. Now, she went through a lot of deliberation, didn't she, before she decides to go through that. And one of the things that Mordecai, her uncle, reminds her of is, you think you're going to escape this by doing nothing? You're going to be found out. And says, don't think to yourself, in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you kept silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But for you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. This is I think this is one of the most important verses, because it's the same for us. How do you know that you're not where you're at for a purpose? That's really hard to ever determine. I mean, now it's neat. You can read the book and go, yeah, she was. But if you're in that situation, and I know I've been in that position, and I hear a lot of people struggling as they're living life, making decisions, career paths, things like this, it's like, I don't know, but maybe that's what God has done. He's put you in that location for a purpose, for some reason to do that. And And if you don't, it's going to come from somewhere. See the faith that Mordecai has? That he has faith that, you know what? It's going to come from somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So we can see he has faith. You notice that's where you think that he would have said God, right? You'd have thought he would have said, well, God will be taking care of us one way or another. I don't know if it's just an oversight, but the point is the providential side, that he understands that God will take care of it. Now, if we think about that for us today, we have a lot of things that we know very solidly by reading the Bible, what God has promised us. And a lot of times we need to remember that as well, that God will take care of us. I don't know how I'm going to get out of a certain situation, but I have faith that it's going to happen, that it will be taken care of. And I see this with the way Mordecai. So it's kind of the way she approaches this is kind of interesting too, isn't it? The way she approaches it, once she does, the king, it's interesting because the king seems to be thrilled when he sees her. You know, he sees her from outside and he's like, what do you want? And he repeats this one phrase, ask me what you want, even up to what? Half of my kingdom and I will give it. So it's interesting how what she thought she was going to face was probable or possible death. Her fear was stopping her. But whenever she approached, it was the opposite, the direct opposite, wasn't it? And so she makes a request. She prepared a banquet. And she specifies she wants who there? Haman and the king. Haman's just over the moon, isn't he? He's like, whoa, look at me, you know. And so he goes to the banquet, and the king, I don't know why he keeps asking that question, but he asks her again, doesn't he? What do you want? Make your wish. I will make it happen, up to half of my kingdom. And she sets up another banquet, doesn't she? And so she goes, my wish and desire is to have another banquet tomorrow. And that's another one. Why didn't she get it out in front? On the first banquet? Right. I can't figure out why she did the two banquet. First one, maybe that was just setting the stage. You know, I think also it could have been her nervousness, you know, that, okay, I got him there. And then like, okay, and she didn't come through because she then says, okay, I want to hold another one tomorrow with just Haman and you, right? But Haman, man, he just thinks that is amazing, doesn't she? You know, thinks that that's a wonderful thing. Wow, I'm so special. So he heads out. Guess who he runs into? Mordecai. And this is where hatred will destroy you. That's why forgiveness is so important. You know, a lot of people say, well, the person didn't ask for forgiveness. It doesn't matter. A part of the forgiving is the letting go for you. And I see that with Haman, that where he is so bitter. He's already going to get him killed. So why can't you let it go? One event where you walk by and you see the guy, you already know he's not going to bow down. You already got a death decree, a death sentence on the man. You can't wait because he just spirals, doesn't he? So, he plans to basically, kill him. He goes home, and it's kind of interesting because, as he sets up this gallows, little does he know that it's going to be his gallows. This is where the story changes in 6. This is where we talked about how that for one event, the opposite, you know, how everything is going one direction, so negative, and there's one key event, and then all of a sudden now everything starts changing. And it all around insomnia. King can't sleep. And so he calls in somebody to do some light reading, read the Chronicles. This is the arrogance of this guy. Because you know that whoever's writing those chronicles, the diary of everything that's happening, makes everything look good, right? He writes it, but you know, it's always so he has this guy come in, a servant, and he reads the daily or the chronicles of history, and all of a sudden he reads about how this plot to assassinate him had been foiled by this man named Mordecai. And then he goes, whoa, what did we do for him? Because it's not written down. They didn't record. You know, he got no reward or anything. And so that's when, you know, he decides that I need to honor him. So when he wakes up in the morning, you know, the first thing he's on his mind is to honor him. And so he sees Hagman and goes, oh, there's my top guy. Let me get some advice from him. But the pride of Haman is seeing a completely different view, isn't he? Huh? Yeah, I mean, it's like, and so the king asked, you know, what honor or distinction has been bestowed upon him, right? And he says, nothing. And Haman is there standing in the court. And then the king said, let him come in. And so, you know, the king's just asking, you know, so Haman comes in and the king said, what should I do for the man whom the king delights to honor? And king, you can almost see Haman. Oh, okay. And so Haman says, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on a horse through the city square, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. So even in that self-aggrandizing, right, trying to make himself look so powerful and beautiful and important, then he even debases the other. He wants a nobleman, somebody else that is kind of maybe competition, you know, to go out and debase themselves and lead them and dress him up and then lead the horse and make this nobleman do all this proclamation of humiliation that how much Hagman thinks he is going to get all this. He's going to, it's just, that's how sick that this anger has caused him. This is, and so then the king said to him, hurry, take the robes and do as you have said, and do so to Mordecai, the man that he built the gallows for the day before. What's that? Oh, yeah. Oh, can you just imagine? He probably almost threw up. You know how you can read, you know, they talk about body language, the telltales, you know. Oh, I bet you could read him. I don't see how he could not be turning glowing red and veins sticking out of his forehead and just like, and again, we're seeing something happen that we don't know that God is making happen. But why could he not sleep that night, right? Why were they reading the Chronicles? And why that section where Mordecai's name comes up? See? There's nothing that said that, you know, God made him read that section, so, you know, that God was doing this. But it's obvious, you can see. And the way that it plays out is even more beautiful because it is, and remember again, what does God think of the Amalekites? We talked about the Amalekites, and that's his heritage, and look what he's trying to do. He's trying to do basically genocide on God's covenant people, and God has not forgot. You know what? Your lineage should have been wiped out 1,000 years ago. I have not forgot what you did to my people when they came up out of Egypt. You can almost see this playing out in a wicked way, in a wise, brilliant way, to come and bring his judgment upon him. And so he does. You know, he has to, and then in verse 12 of 6, then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. Haman told his wife and all his friends what happened. And it's interesting, his wife says, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but surely fall before him. So, while they're talking, we see this eunuch, while they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived to hurry to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. He probably would love to get out of that. Just the fact of being so humiliated. He doesn't even know what's going to happen. But the state of mind that he has probably worked himself up in, you know, the last place he wants to be is to probably go back, you know, even though, you know, because he's been, his ego has been so insulted, right? So he goes to the feast on the second day. They're drinking wine. See, this is what I mean. But if you read through this, they're drinking wine. You know, it's like, again, the king asked, what is your wish? What do you want? I'll give up half of my kingdom. And then Esther said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. And if we have been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Oh, man, that is amazing. That she starts out because she knows she's important to the king. So she starts out by saying, my life. And then immediately in that, she's relating almost who she is. She's Jewish. So she goes brilliantly, I want my life because I'm under a death sentence, and my people, right? They're marked to be destroyed. And then the king asks the question, who is he? Where is he? Who has dared to do this? Again, I'm still like, duh, come on, guy. You don't remember this? You gave your ring. You got, money for it. You're so oblivious to what's going on. And Esther said, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. Haman was terrified before the king. And the king was angry, of course. Verse 7, he has wrath from the wine drinking. See there again? Wine drinking. He's probably a little intoxicated. And went into the palace garden because he's outraged, right? He just burst out. But Haman stayed and begged for his life. Not too proud to beg, right? From Queen Esther. For he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returns from the palace garden, and where they were drinking wine. See again, drinking wine. You notice there's a lot of drinking wine throughout this story. And Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was, and the king says, will he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house? I love verse 9. Harbaron. It's interesting, you get a name of a eunuch. Isn't that interesting? Usually it just say, and a eunuch, but we're given a name. Who did this was in attendance So he didn't like Haman either, because he has no problem with telling the king, yeah, by the way, Haman built the gallows that he was prepared for Mordecai to hang. He's totally done, isn't he? Yeah, and he even says, I like the way he says that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king. Just in case you've forgotten your little too much wine on board, he saved you. And he gives a description. I don't know how, maybe he was one that went and got Haman, and went to his house. And so he went by and saw that gallows standing there like, what's that for? And probably found out. So they hanged him on the gallows and prepared that he had prepared for him. And then the king calmed down. But the problem is what? Yep. So the problem is he's made a decree, and apparently a king can't even undo his own decree, right? And so he tries, Esther tries to say, let it be undone. And he can't do it. He says, I can't undo this. So he does what? Allows them through decree with his ring. Remember that. First ring sealed a decree for their destruction. The ring again seals another letter that's going to go out that's going to allow them to defend themselves. And that allows them, and Mordecai is elevated, basically replaces Haman. Yep, his house, everything. So they allow them to defend themselves. And chapters 9 and 10 talk about that they are victorious, they defend themselves. I know I'm kind of running over it. But I want to bring up Purim, because after it's over, another feast. You notice there's banquets. You notice that? There's like, and I'm going to show you the puzzle in a minute. Because at the end of it, we find there's another kind of banquet for 2 days, which establishes Purim. Now that is the same word used for the dice that Haman had used to roll to determine the date in which they would then go and execute and destroy all of the Jews. So the book closes, with they're secure and they're honored. So some of the key, now let's wrap kind of it up in a way. I mean, there's a lot we're going over kind of quickly for 10 chapters. I think, like I said, the providence is one of the things that we don't see named, but man, as you look at the story, you see that God is taking care of his people. Things in ways that we would not be able to predict and see happening, unfolding, they do. That's for you too, and me. That when we're looking at problems and things that we can't see a resolution to, we put our faith that God will take care of us. We don't know how it's going to happen, but we know that it will happen. This grieving, the mourning, this is what I mean about the reversal. The whole thing is on reversal. Chapter 6 is that reverse. Everything that had happened up to that point. And that courage is something that, a lot of times, there's some people that are very brave. They don't have a problem. But, there's a lot of times, and I see it as Christians today, standing up for what is morally right, what is decent, and being able to have, the courage that even, and especially, within the past 5 years, saying that I disagree with some of the moral standards and some of the words you're redefining and that are immoral, indecent, and you're saying, oh, that's good now. It's sickening. And a lot of Christians, they're afraid. They're afraid to say that, I'm sorry, that marriage should be only a man and a woman. and that there are only two sexes, a male and female. Why? Because now you're a hater. You're the hater. And I mean, that's just two very hot button ones, but there's a lot of those as well that if you don't go along, and I'm sorry, but a lot of Christians have become very frightened that they're going to be ridiculed. Or in the YouTube world, I mean, even now, I mean, people are losing channels or getting attacked and stuff. And I'm sorry, that's a lack of courage. We have to know that there's some personal risk. Otherwise, and I want to bring in what Mordecai said. God's going to deliver and complete what he desires with or without us. Right? With or without us. And maybe this moment in our history is exactly why we're here. To be able to stand fast for God's truth. And so, it's interesting because, I'm going through 1 Peter, and the whole theme has been what? How do Christians survive in a hostile world? Right? And we see that, look at the hostile world that Esther was living in like that. And understand that God is going to remain faithful. He's providentially working. But it seems like we want affirmation. We'd love to get a text message that says, good job, Ron, signed God, so we would know. But we don't. That's not the way God takes care of us, that as well. The pivot of this book is really that one night. That one night that he couldn't sleep. And I think that's the way that the Providence started to turn this whole story. Just for time. A castic is a literary style of writing where you have two things. And so if you follow this, and I know it looks kind of confusing, start with where it says Vashti's fall. And then come down, Haman's rise. Now, if you go from Vashti's fall, see the ... to Haman's fall, these are the opposite. So as the writer of Esther tells the story, has Vashti's fall, Haman's rise, decree of death, Mordecai mourns, and then the opposite of all those was Haman's fall, Mordecai's rise, decree of life, the Jews celebrate. So it's kind of just a structure that the way that I know a lot of times that even if you didn't understand that, it's a beautiful book, But you notice right in the middle there is that pivot, chapter 6. So this book was written with this style on purpose, the way that we could draw more out of it, I guess. So even when God is still at work. That's the thing that blows my mind. Somehow I think that people think that God is on vacation or, there are actually some religious people who do think that God has kind of like put us on auto and just let it happen. He's never done that. He's never done that. So why is he doing it now? That's why I say it's important to understand history. You need to understand the history of God and see how God operated through the Old Testament. You can see that he used nations as his instrument to deliver judgments. And then when that nation that he used was, becoming sinful and appalling, he had punished them too. He did it with the Assyrians. He did it with the Babylonians. So what do you think about today? So, we have to be careful. But I mean, honestly, he hasn't just stood back and stopped. He's the same God. He doesn't change. So he is still at work accomplishing what he wants to get accomplished. And so, another part is we have to really think about where we're at as we're living our lives and look at these times and think about maybe I'm at the right place at the right time. And I have a responsibility to serve, to do certain things like that. The big one as well is pride destroys. And it destroys good Christians too. And it's a cancer, because it creates that anger that we saw that he had. And I think one of the great ones as well is that God can reverse what seems hopeless. Remember, the king said, I can't even undo my own decree. We came so far. Man, we almost made it. Reverse it. Let them defend themselves. I want you to remember that as well. A lot of times we feel like that we're in a hopeless situation. Understand, God can reverse. And I think remember and celebrate God's deliverances. So, any closing thoughts? It's a lot to pack in. I know it kind of makes it a long class, but again, I hope that you enjoyed it. Again, like I said, we're trying to survey it, not dive too deep into it. Any thoughts about the book? Or all right. Well, I hope to see you Sunday morning at 9:45 for Bible study. If you're out there and you're watching us, you can make it down here and worship with us. And for Bible study, and then 10:45 for worship, 4 p.m. in the afternoon. And then next Wednesday, we'll start Samuel, 1 Samuel. So if you want to go ahead and start reading that and get ready for it. Thank you very much. Till we see you again. God bless.